Hey guys, welcome back to more r/malicious compliance Reddit stories. In this video, a ridiculously entitled company built an illegal storage depot on my ranch while I was absent and then dares me to sue them. Here is what happened. So buckle up because this is a long one, but I promise the ending is worth it. Some background first. So I own a 2,400 acre cattle ranch that's been in my family for 4 generations. It is not huge by Texas standards, but it's mine, and I've put my blood, sweat and tears into keeping it running. The property sits about 40 miles outside of town, mostly grassland with some wooded areas and a creek running through the southern portion. I run about 600 head of cattle, and while it's not making me rich, it pays the bills and it gives me the life I want. The ranch has one main access road that connects to the county highway, plus several old ranch roads that crisscross the property for moving cattle and equipment, and there's also an old abandoned railroad spur that runs along the northern edge of my land. The tracks were pulled up decades ago, but the railroad company still technically owns that easement. Though they haven't used it for anything in over 30 years, now I'm not the type to just sit on the ranch all year though. Every winter my wife and I take about 6 weeks to visit our daughter and grandkids who live overseas. We've been doing this for the past 8 years since she moved abroad for work. This particular winter we left in early February for what was supposed to be our usual 6-week trip. Everything was normal when we left, cattle were healthy, all the equipment was secured, and I'd given my friend his usual instructions. I even did a final drive around the property the morning we left just to make sure everything looked good. We were having a great time with our grandkids and I was actually relaxing for once. My friend called every couple of days with updates and everything seemed fine. The cattle were doing well, no equipment problems, no issues with fencing or water systems, and I was starting to think this might be the most peaceful trip we'd ever taken, but sadly, I injured myself while we were doing some outdoor activities and we had to postpone returning to the ranch for quite a while. Then sometime into our trip, I got a call that changed everything. It was not from my friend, it was from my neighbor whose property adjoins mine on the eastern side. "Hey, I don't know if you know about this, but there's been a lot of heavy traffic going to and from your place for the past weeks," he said. "Looks like some kind of construction project. Just thought you would want to know." That was weird. I had not authorized any construction and my friend had not mentioned anything about it. I immediately called him, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again an hour later, same thing. Now I was starting to worry. I called my neighbor back and asked if he could drive over and take a look at what was happening. He agreed and called me back an hour later with news that made my blood run cold. "There's a whole industrial operation set up on your property," he said. "Looks like some kind of storage facility. There are huge metal buildings, concrete pads and a bunch of trucks coming and going." I couldn't get too close because they've got the whole area fenced off, but I can see it from the ridge on my property. I was stunned. Someone had built structures on my land without my permission while I was gone. This had to be some kind of mistake, maybe they'd gotten confused about property lines or something, so I spent the next several hours trying to reach my friend, finally getting through late that evening. "I tried calling you about this last week, but I couldn't get through," he said, sounding stressed. "They had official-looking documents and said they had a lease agreement with you. When I told them I'd never heard about it, they got real aggressive and said I was just hired help and didn't need to know about your business deals. They threatened to have me arrested for interfering if I didn't stay away from their operation." Now I understood why he seemed invasive. This guy had been working for me for over 5 years and he knew something wasn't right, but he had been intimidated into backing down. I spent a sleepless night trying to figure out what to do. Cutting our trip short would cost us thousands in change fees and lost deposits, but I couldn't just let some company use my land without my permission. So the next morning I started making calls. First I called the county sheriff's office. The deputy I spoke with was sympathetic but said that this sounded like a civil matter, not a criminal one. He simply suggested I contact a lawyer and try to resolve it through proper legal channels, and he did agree to send someone out to document what was happening, which was something at least. Next I called my lawyer back home. He has handled all my ranch business for years, mainly property disputes and contract issues. When I explained the situation, he was as baffled as I was. "Someone just built structures on your property without permission?" he asked. "That's trespassing and conversion at minimum. Do you have any idea who it is?" I didn't, but I was about to find out. He agreed to drive out to the ranch that afternoon and investigate for me. He called me back that evening with more details. "It's a company called Apex Industrial Storage, name changed for privacy reasons," he said. "They've built what looks like a chemical storage facility or something. There are 3 large metal buildings, concrete containment areas, and a bunch of industrial equipment. The whole operation covers about 15 acres of your property." Apex Industrial Storage. I'd never heard of them, but they'd apparently heard of my property. My lawyer had managed to speak with someone on site, and they claimed they had a valid lease agreement. When he asked to see it, they refused and told him to contact their legal department. This was getting more bizarre by the minute. I was certain I'd never signed any lease with anyone, let alone for a chemical storage facility. My lawyer suggested that we needed to move fast to get this resolved. I'm gonna file for an immediate restraining order to stop any further construction, he said. But you should probably think about coming home sooner rather than later. This is a big deal, and it's only gonna get more complicated. The next morning, I was on the phone with airlines trying to change flights when my lawyer called with an update that made everything worse. "I've got bad news," he said. I filed the paperwork for the restraining order, but Apex lawyers responded immediately. They are claiming they got a valid 20-year lease for that portion of your property signed by you 3 years ago. They've provided a copy to the court as well. My heart sank. That's impossible. I never signed anything with them. I know, but they've got a document with what appears to be your signature. We're going to need to prove it is forged, which means we need you to get back here as soon as possible. I hung up and immediately called the airline. The change fees were brutal, but we were on a flight home that evening. During the long trip back, my mind was racing. How had someone forged my signature well enough to fool a court, even temporarily? What was this company storing on my land, and why had they chosen my property specifically? We landed late the next evening, and I drove straight to the ranch instead of going home first. What I saw when I got there was even worse than I'd imagined. The operation was massive, 3 enormous metal buildings. There were even concrete containment areas, industrial lighting, and a network of pipes connecting the buildings. The whole area was surrounded by chain link fencing topped with razor wire, and there were security cameras everywhere. But the worst part was the smell. Even from a distance I could detect a sharp chemical odor that made my eyes water. Whatever they were storing in those buildings, it was not harmless. I drove back to town that night and met with my lawyer first thing in the morning. He'd been busy while I was traveling and had some disturbing news. "So I've been researching Apex Industrial Storage," he said, "and they are a subsidiary of a larger chemical company that specializes in hazardous waste storage. The facility they have built in your property appears to be designed for storing industrial chemicals and potentially hazardous materials." Well, that explained the smell and the elaborate containment systems. But it raised even more questions about what they were doing on my land. "There's more," he continued. "I've checked with the county and they never applied for any permits for this construction. The state environmental agency has no record of permits either. Whatever they are doing it without proper authorization." This was a disaster. Not only had they built on my property without permission, but they were potentially storing hazardous materials without proper permits. If something went wrong, I could be held liable as the landowner. My lawyer had managed to get a copy of the alleged lease agreement that Apex was using to justify their presence. When I saw it, I was shocked by how authentic it looked. The document was an official-looking letterhead, had all the correct legal language, and bore what appeared to be my signature, but I knew I had never signed it. The signature was close to mine, but there were subtle differences that I could spot because I knew my own handwriting. The bigger problem would be proving it was forged in court. "We need a handwriting expert," my lawyer said. "But that's gonna take time, and meanwhile they're gonna continue to operate on your property." The next few days were a blur of legal activity. My lawyer filed multiple motions seeking to stop Apex operations immediately, while their lawyers fought back with their own paperwork claiming they had every right to be there. In the meantime, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I drove out to the ranch every day, staying on my own property but observing the operation from a distance, and the level of activity was incredible. Trucks were arriving and departing constantly, and I could see workers in hazmat suits moving around the facility. I also started documenting everything. I took hundreds of photos and videos from every angle I could manage without trespassing on the area they had fenced off. I noted license plate numbers, company names on trucks, and timestamps for all the activity. One afternoon, while I was taking photos from a hill overlooking the facility, a security guard approached me. He was polite but firm and said, "Sir, you're going to need to move away from the fence line." He said, "This is my property," I replied. "I own this land." He looked uncomfortable. "I understand, sir, but we've got a lease agreement that gives us exclusive use of this area. You're not supposed to be within 500 feet of our operation." Well, that was news to me. I had read through the forged lease agreement multiple times, and there was no mention of any exclusion zone. I told him as much, but he just repeated that I needed to leave. "If you got a problem with the lease terms, you will need to take it up with our legal department," he said. I was getting tired of hearing about their legal department. I took a few more photos and then left, but I was more determined than ever to get to the bottom of this. The hearing arrived and both sides presented their arguments. Apex lawyers were confident and professional, presenting their lease agreement and arguing that I was simply having seller's remorse about a deal I had made. They painted me as an unreliable rancher who was trying to back out of a profitable agreement, and my lawyer countered by questioning the authenticity of the signature and pointing out all the missing permits and environmental approvals. He also raised concerns about the potential environmental impact of the facility. The judge listened to both sides and then announced his decision. He was not ready to rule on the validity of the lease without more evidence, but he was concerned enough about the permit issues to order Apex to cease all new construction and operations until they could provide proof of proper environmental approvals. It was a partial victory, but Apex lawyers immediately announced they would appeal. Outside the courthouse, their lead attorney approached me directly. "You know, this is gonna cost you a lot more than it's worth," he said with a smirk. "We are a major corporation with deep pockets and excellent lawyers. You're just a small-time rancher who's in over his head. You should consider cutting your losses and working with us instead of against us." I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Are you suggesting I should just give up?" "I'm suggesting you should be realistic about your chances," he replied. "We have a valid lease agreement and we're prepared to defend our rights. If you want to sue us, go ahead. I dare you to do it. We will bury you in paperwork and legal fees until you give up." That was the moment everything changed. Up until then, I'd been focused on getting them off my property and undoing the damage they had done, but this arrogant attitude and thinly veiled threat made me realize this was about more than just my ranch. This company thought they could bulldoze over anyone who got in their way. "You know what?" I said. "I think I will sue you and comply with what you said. Thanks for the suggestion." He laughed. "Ha, good luck with that. You will need it." That night, I called my lawyer and told him about the conversation. He'd been focused on getting the restraining order and stopping their operations, but now I wanted to explore other options too. What would it take to sue them for everything they've done? I asked. He thought for a moment and then said, "Well, there are several potential claims. Trespassing, conversion, fraud, if we can prove the lease is forged, environmental violations and potentially others. But it would be expensive and time-consuming." How expensive? Probably hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and it could take years to resolve. I thought about the attorney's smug confidence and his assumption that I could not afford to fight them. What if we could prove that they've done this before? What if this is not the first time they've pulled something like this? That got his attention. If we could show a pattern of behavior, it would strengthen our case significantly. Why do you think they have? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. The next morning I started researching Apex Industrial Storage and their parent company. I spent hours online reading news articles, court records and regulatory filings, and what I found was disturbing. Over the past 5 years, Apex had been involved in at least a dozen similar disputes with landowners across 3 states. In most cases, they'd eventually settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, and in a few cases they'd actually been caught using forged documents to justify their operations. Even more troubling, I found several environmental violations and fines levied against the company for improper storage and handling of hazardous materials. They had a pattern of operating first and seeking permits later, betting that the cost of fines would be less than the profit from their operations. I compiled everything I had found and presented it to my lawyer. His eyes widened as he read through the documents. "This is a game changer," he said. "If we can establish a pattern of fraudulent behavior, we are not just looking at compensation for your damages, we could be looking at punitive damages and potentially criminal referrals." We immediately started preparing a comprehensive lawsuit, but first we needed to prove the lease was forged. My lawyer arranged for a handwriting expert to examine both the disputed document and samples of my actual signature, and the expert's report was conclusive. Not only was the signature forged, but it was done using a technique called projection tracing, where someone uses technology to trace over an authentic signature from another document. By examining the ink patterns and pressure points, the expert could prove definitely that the signature was not authentic. Armed with this evidence, we filed a massive lawsuit against Apex Industrial Storage and their parent company. We alleged fraud, trespassing, conversion, environmental violations, and racketeering under the RICO Act, claiming they had engaged in a pattern of criminal behavior. The lawsuit made local news, and that's when things got really interesting. My phone started ringing with calls from other landowners who had similar experiences with Apex. A rancher in Oklahoma told me almost the exact same story. They had built a facility on his property while he was away and then produced a forged lease when confronted. A farmer in Arkansas had discovered Apex dumping chemicals on his land without permission, and when he complained they had threatened to sue him for breach of contract, claiming he'd agreed to let them use his property as a disposal site. Each news story strengthened our case. My lawyer was able to add these landowners as co-plaintiffs, and we began building a class action lawsuit that spanned multiple states. But Apex was not going down without a fight. They hired one of the most expensive law firms in the country and began a campaign of aggressive litigation tactics designed to wear us down. They filed motion after motion, demanded thousands of pages of documents, and scheduled endless depositions. Their strategy was exactly what their attorney had threatened: bury us in paperwork and legal fees until we gave up. But they made one crucial mistake. They had assumed I was just a small-time rancher with limited resources, but what they didn't know was that my family had been very successful in the cattle business for 4 generations. My grandfather had made some very smart investments in land and oil rights that had paid off handsomely over the years. And while I lived modestly and worked the ranch because I loved it, I had access to significant financial resources when needed. I was prepared to spend whatever it took to see this through. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was extensive and expansive, but it was also incredibly revealing. Through court-ordered document production, we gained access to Apex's internal communications and business records. What we found was even worse than I'd imagined. The company had developed a systematic approach to illegal land use, and they would identify rural properties with absentee owners, forge lease agreements, and begin operations immediately. Their business model was based on the assumption that most small landowners would not have the resources to fight them back effectively. They had a network of people who specialized in creating fake lease agreements and other legal documents. The operation was far more sophisticated and widespread than we had initially realized. As the evidence mounted, Apex's legal strategy began to shift. Instead of denying the allegations, they started trying to minimize their liability. Their lawyers reached out to mine several times with settlement offers, but I was not interested in settling. The attorney who had been so smug at our first meeting was not quite as confident anymore. During one deposition, my lawyer asked him directly about his threat to bury me in paperwork, and I was simply explaining the reality of complex litigation. He said nervously, "I never intended to threaten anyone." "But did you tell him you would bury him in legal fees until he gave up, correct?" "Well, I may have used that phrase, but it was just a figure of my speech." My lawyer smiled. A figure of speech that you've used with other landowners your client has defrauded, according to these sworn affidavits. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in federal court. The courthouse was packed with reporters, other landowners, and environmental activists who had been following the case. Apex's executives looked confident as they walked into the building, but I could see the strain beginning to show. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. We presented evidence of the forged lease, the pattern of similar fraud behavior, and the environmental violations and the internal communications that showed the company's systematic approach to illegal land use. The handwriting expert testified about the forged signature, explaining in detail how it had been created and why it was definitely not authentic. The other landowners told their stories, painting a picture of a company that routinely victimized rural property owners. Environmental experts testify about the potential damage from the illegal storage facility and the risks posed by operating without proper permits. The testimony was technical but damning, showing that Apex had violated numerous federal and state environmental laws. But the most powerful testimony came from a former Apex employee who had grown disgusted with the company's practices and agreed to testify against them. One former manager described the document forgery operation in detail, explaining how they targeted properties and created fake legal documents. "We called it the country mouse strategy," he testified. "The idea was to find unsophisticated landowners who wouldn't know how to fight back effectively. Rural ranchers and farmers were considered ideal targets because they often traveled for business and wouldn't notice construction activities for weeks or months." And when it was Apex's turn to present their defense, their attorneys struggled to counter the mountain of evidence against them. They tried to argue that the company had operated in good faith, believing their lease agreements were valid, but the internal communications clearly showed they knew they were engaging in fraud. Their CEO took the stand and was absolutely destroyed under cross-examination. My lawyer walked him through email after email showing the company's systematic approach to illegal land use, and when confronted with his own words describing landowners as unsophisticated marks, he claimed he couldn't remember writing the emails. "So you don't remember writing an email describing my client as a backwoods rancher who probably cannot even read?" my lawyer asked. I write a lot of emails, the CEO said weakly. I cannot remember every single one. This email was sent just 3 days before your company began construction on his property. You don't remember planning to defraud my client? The CEO's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The jury had seen exactly what kind of people they were dealing with. The trial lasted 3 weeks and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was silent as the 4 men read the decision, guilty on all counts. But that was just the beginning. The jury then had to decide on damages, and this is where things got really interesting. In addition to compensatory damages for the cost of removing the facility and restoring my land, they awarded punitive damages that were substantial. The total award was several $million. Don't want to be too precise here, otherwise I might get doxxed. The number was larger than I'd ever imagined possible. The jury had clearly wanted to send a message that this kind of systematic fraud would not be tolerated. The aftermath was swift and decisive though. Apex Industrial Storage filed for bankruptcy. Within 6 months of the verdict, their parent company tried to distance themselves from the subsidiary, but our lawyers were able to pierce the corporate veil and hold them liable as well. Several Apex executives were indicted on federal fraud charges and are currently awaiting trial. The former CEO has been charged with racketeering and faces up to 20 years in federal prison if convicted. The environmental cleanup of my property took almost 18 months and cost the company's insurance carriers over $1 million. They had to remove all the buildings, excavate contaminated soil, and restore the land to its original condition. The creek that runs through my property had to be extensively tested and treated because of chemical contamination from their operations. However, perhaps the most satisfying part was watching the arrogant attorney who had threatened to bury me in legal fees. He was eventually sanctioned by the court for his role in presenting fraudulent documents and faces potential disciplinary action from the State Bar Association. The last time I saw him was outside the courthouse after the verdict was announced. He looked defeated and exhausted and a far cry from the smug confidence he had displayed when he first threatened me. I guess you got your lawsuit, he said bitterly. You suggested it, I replied. I was just following your advice. As for my ranch, it's better than ever. With the settlement money, I was able to make improvements I've been putting off for years. I upgraded all the equipment, improved the fencing and water systems, and even bought additional land to expand the operation. And now let's read one last brand new story. It is titled, I Made My Own Schedule, posted on r/malicious compliance. So I work the night shift as a cashier at a 24/7 convenience store. My shift is from 10 p.m. to 5:30 a.m. and usually my coworker and I switch tasks like she's at the counter while I help the customers. Lately I've been dealing with constant headaches, so I asked our manager if I could take a night off. But instead of approving it, she snapped, if you don't like the schedule, make your own. So I did. I skipped 2 nights and then worked only 4 hours on the 3rd night and took another night off after that. When I finally came back, she scolded me saying, that's not what I meant. I told her, well, you said make my own schedule, so I did. Now the whole staff, whether day shift or night shift, is asking if they can customize their schedules too. Funny how she suddenly cares about clear communication. Shout out to our manager of the year, ma'am knows it all. P.S. I did put my phone to D&D so that I won't notify her with calls and texts. Also, our manager only goes to the store every Monday. I asked her Monday night. My working days are Monday to Saturday. And yeah guys, thank you for watching. I will see you again tomorrow.